Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the week of the catastrophe. The catastrophe. Parshat Shlach begins innocently enough with a command by God to Moshe, send for yourself people who will spy out the land. And before we know what's happened, everything has fallen apart. The result of the spies' report and the people's reaction to the spies' report is that the people in the end come to, for the first time, after years of complaining, not years, from the time they left Egypt, months of complaining, that they want to go back to Egypt. For the first time they say, let's actually do it. Nitna rosh v'nashuva Mitzrayim. Let's appoint a new leader. So it's a political speech at this moment. Let's appoint a leader and let's return to Egypt. And that attitude of the people, that response of the people to the spy mission, leads God to decree that the people will now wander the desert for 40 years rather than going straight into the land. So there's going to be some strange latency period. There's going to be a period now in which they will be left in a way to die gradually. It'll be a dying time. That's the way it's described. That instead of dying at one fell swoop in punishment for whatever the sin was of the spies, God listens to Moshe's prayers and relents to the extent of spreading it out over 40 years. Right? So you have now a dying that will happen every night every year on the anniversary of the spy story, which is reckoned in Jewish tradition to be the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, which will be a night and a day of calamity. It'll be a day of calamity throughout Jewish history. So it's a way of saying, in a sense, that it's not only the promises of the past that will come to a catastrophic closure now, in a sense. They're not going straight into the land, but it's the whole future that in a way is already pre-shattered. There's something about that night and that day in which things will always tend to fall apart. There's something about that experience. No? Say what? Oh, that's not, what was the word you used? Not fair. Ah, that may well be. That may well be. I have no argument with that. But let's see where we can go with this. What was it that the people did that was so catastrophic? After all, even if it was a political rebellion simmering there, as it sounds like, let's appoint a leader, it's still all words. They haven't actually done anything. And all they ever do in Sefer Bamidbar is speak. I think we mentioned this already last week. That it's the book of Midbar, and there's a play on the word Midbar that the rabbis indulge in. That Midbar is the desert, the wilderness, but it's also Medaber. It's also, right, it's a kind of shocking play on words, because obviously it's different root. But nevertheless, there is a connection somewhere. It's this empty space, HaMidbar HaGadol VaHaNorah Hazeh, as Moshe calls it later. This great and terrible wilderness. You should understand what a wilderness is. It's not only a place where there's no food and no water, but it's a place that doesn't recognize human presence in any way. You can walk in the desert and whatever effect your steps have left on the sand will be immediately blown away. People can sink down and die in the desert, as will now happen over the next 40 years. That's the way the serial deaths of the people are described. Bamidbar hazeh yiplu pigrechem. Terrible description. Your corpses will fall over into this desert. Every now and then, every year there will be just that collapse into the desert. You get almost a palpable sense of it. And then to be covered up with no sign left. That's what a midbar is, and that is its terribleness. Its terribleness is a matter of fantasy in a way. It's how you imagine that. You imagine the disappearance of a human being in a completely final way. That's it. No marker, no Yad Vashem, no hand, no name. Now, that's the meaning of the word midbar. But the other meaning of the word midbar is Language has something to do with language. Medaber. In this empty space, what can you do but talk? That in a sense, the only way you can leave a mark on what comes after you is by the things you say. And so the people try many, many speech acts, many, many exercises in speech, almost all of them unhappy ones, almost all of them unsuccessful ones, in the end a catastrophic one, which really makes everything fall apart. Now that movement of language, that's what the people are doing, and that's what they'll continue to do. But we can't help noticing that from the moment they left Egypt, from the moment that the Exodus was completed, they actually physically left the country, they crossed the border, it didn't take 2 seconds for them to begin what will become a mantra. They keep repeating the same thing over and over again. It's shocking when it happens right away at the beginning. What's the mantra? Let's return to Egypt. Why on earth did you take us out of Egypt? Why Exodus becomes there? Why on earth Exodus? As if they don't see any meaning in this promise, in this project, and let's return to Egypt over and over again. It's repetitious. I'd almost say that it's compulsive. And I'm going to be talking psychological language tonight, more than usual perhaps, psychoanalytic language. I'm talking here about, I would call it a kind of compulsive, repetitive statement that if someone does this kind of thing, if you find that you or someone you know is constantly harking back to a particular statement, it's always the same thing over and over again, we tend to think that there's a kind of breakdown of some kind. Because normally, a human being who's fully alive shouldn't be always repeating the same thing. He should be, in a way, moving on. At every moment, he may have different complaints, but it's always the same thing. That there's something psychotic, almost, I'd say, about this. It's more than neurotic. A sense, I would suggest, maybe, that something traumatic has happened to this person, which has left him kind of spinning the record, the disc, round and round. It has broken him on some level, and left him saying the same thing over and over again without too much meaning. Almost, it's almost as if this is what comes easiest, to keep saying, "Let's go back to Egypt. Let's go back to Egypt." Now that, what I'm calling the broken record, that aspect of it, makes a human being sound like an automaton. It's not what we like to think a human being is. And when people we know and love begin to do that, so we call it senility, that's one possibility, or we think about the traces that may have been left in this person by the past, that this person is in some way haunted. This person is haunted by some trauma of the past, which somehow irrationally bursts forth every now and then into the particular mantra. Doesn't necessarily relate so much to what's going on in external reality, but it's somehow very important to the person himself to keep saying that. And up to a certain point, God is rather tolerant of this. For instance, in Sefer Shemot, when the people do this, God expects them to do it. God himself says at the moment of when Paro released the people, B'shalach Paro et ha'am, then God said, he said to himself, a kind of soliloquy, he said, I know what's going to happen, that they are going to change their mind when they experience war and want to return to Egypt. They won't think well of the project of Exodus very long. If they are on a high momentarily, it won't take any time at all for them to regress and somewhere run back to Egypt in imagination, in fantasy. And God expects it to happen, as if God reads the map in some way of the human heart, and he says, yes, that's what's going to happen. So I won't make it so easy for them to act on their fantasy. I'm going to take them around the long way rather than the short way. You remember, I think we talked about this. Now, here at this moment, this repetitive statement, here it brings something lethal down on their heads. And I've always felt, this is a very painful parsha. It's a parsha in which I feel very much as you said, is this fair? And I'm not even talking about the future history. I'm talking about that generation. In some way they are broken, right? I'm suggesting. In some way they are broken. Why? I don't know. I have a couple of suggestions, but I don't know. But what you know is what they are manifesting at this moment, how they're behaving. And that's what I want to look at. What kind of behavior would we say this is? One of the main symptoms is this repeated statement, let's go back to Egypt, which seems to sharpen now. And it's set off by the report that the spies bring back. Now, according to the text, it seems that God has commanded, Shlach lecha anashim. Send for yourself, God says to Moshe, send for yourself, what's that lecha? Send for yourself people to spy out the land. Now that sounds clearly as if the command comes from God, and therefore that's not what God blames the people for the very idea of sending spies. Something bad becomes of it, but at the beginning it's God's idea. Now, that's at least how the story seems to read. When the spies come back, what do they say? Let's do a quick overview of the story and listen to the words, because it's the words that are important. It's not the story. It's what people say. The spies come back and they tell a story. Vayisapru. They have a story to tell. It's not called a report, it's called a story. And they said, we came to the land where you sent us, and indeed it is a land flowing with milk and honey. Right? You asked us, is it a good land or a bad land? That was part of the questionnaire that Moshe sent with the spies. And you could say it's the most important question on the questionnaire. Is it a good land or a bad land? Then asking about the strength of the inhabitants and if the cities are fortified and if it's a fertile land and so on. But is it a good land or a bad land? That seems to be the largest general way of telling the story of the land. And they come back and they tell a story about what wonderful fruit it has. It really is a land flowing with milk and honey. In other words, it's a good land. And we've even thought to bring you a sample in order to show you what a good land it is. So it was not only seeing, they obeyed God, Moshe's command, which is to go and see. Go and see the land, to spy out the land, latur et haaretz, but it's lirot, to see. And come back and tell us what you've seen. And they come back and they not only, they show as well as tell. They tell the story and they show to the people, look what a good land it is. Now that's an exemplary, you might say that's an exemplary fulfillment of God's command, of Moshe's command. He asked them a question and they answer it. They answer it honestly and even favorably. And the fact that they call the land land flowing with milk and honey also means that their story is it's kind of literary story, because it echoes what God had said to Moshe at the burning bush about this whole project, this long project of getting to the land. And he had called the land a land flowing with milk and honey, Eretz Tova Urochava, a good and spacious land. And a land, that was the image God had used. A land flowing with milk and honey. And they come back and they quote it, and they sound just like good children. You know, they come back and they say exactly the right words. Yes, you see, God was right. He promised us, you know, we have no doubt anymore. All right, whatever our motivations may have been for going on this mission, we are fully satisfied. It's good, and here comes the catastrophe. And it's a verbal catastrophe. It's a word that brings everything down around their ears. And it's a word, Ramban points out, Ramban is the first one who pointed out the literary force of this word, how the whole story now pivots on this word. And the word is ephes, which is a most unusual word in the Torah or in Tanakh in general, to act as is that what a conjunction is? Yes, it's a conjunction. Yes, I've forgotten my grammar, too long ago. But conjunction, like and or but, it's however. That's the way it's usually translated. But really it means, of course, ephes means nothingness, zero. And I want to listen to the words. Because it's important to me now to try to get at understanding what kind of a state are the people in, are the spies in, if they use the words they use. Now the word they use is not aval, which also would be an unusual word actually in the Bible. It could have just been the conjunction vav, right? It's a good land. However, that's how it's usually translated. However, the people are too strong. The people who live there are too strong, and the cities are fortified. They're big and fortified, and moreover, and then suddenly the tone changes, I want to say. So far, they're answering Moshe's questions. He did ask, are the cities fortified? What's the strength of the people? So now they come and bring a very fearful report. And they say, basically, it can be as good as it likes. It's a good land, but it's too much for us. We can't do it. But then the tone shifts from a rational tone of report on the strategic situation there, will we or won't we be able to deal with it, suddenly to what I'll call a language of fantasy. And the fantasy is the reference to giants. And they keep reverting to giants. It's not as if saying it once is not enough. Right? We talked about this last week, how if you repeat something, what does that tell you? Right? It doesn't tell you necessarily that you feel very secure about saying this. It could be that what you're saying makes you so insecure that you almost, in a kind of madness, you keep repeating it. I just can't get my mind unstuck from this. What? That there are giants there. We saw Yilidei, how do they call them here? We saw Yilidei Ha'anak, and they emphasize we saw them. And so they're saying, we really saw them. We're eyewitnesses. This is not hearsay. That we really did see them. But when they emphasize that we saw them, they're also saying almost the opposite. We saw them as giants. In our eyes, they were giants. Now, what is the actual truth? Were there giants or were there not giants, historically, in the land at that time? So there is an argument, if we want to be charitable to the spies and say it wasn't all fantasy, that there is an argument, you remember in Sefer Bereshit, at the beginning there with the early generations, there is a reference to Nephilim who lived in the land. Nephilim is giants. There's another word for giants. So there's a strange reference to some kind of science fiction, kind of alternative reality, other races, other genetic possibilities that there were in the world at the beginning of time. And this is called the children of those giants in a way. So all right, so let's be charitable, and let's say there really were in Eretz Israel at this time some very large people. Right. Some gigantic people. So the report is true. But if it was just factual, then to say it once would be enough. What happens instead? There is now, they revert to rational language, to reporting language, and the Amalekites live there in the south, and then the 7 nations who live in the country are listed. In other words, they're reporting in a rational way. What's going on there? What is the population there? And they finish speaking, and we're told very subtly. We're not told what the national reaction is to this report, but we are told that Kalev, the good spy, has to shush the people because there's such an outbreak of panic. Vayahas Kalev et ha'am el Moshe. It's really very oblique. It doesn't say clearly that there was an uproar. It says that Moshe has to quiet the people, that there's an immediate uproar. The people are stirred by what the spies say, and they could be stirred by the rational report. It's a strong people, but I think they're more disturbed by the report of giants, because that is something that, it's almost as if everyone is haunted by the idea of giants. And Kalev shushes them and says, we shall go up and we shall conquer it. We are capable of doing it. And the other spies absolutely deny it and say, Lo nuchal la'alot. We can't go up. We can't do it. Why? Because the people are too strong for us. Now that's a rational statement, I would say. The people are too strong. That's within the limits of reason. You asked us to report what the situation is, and we think it's impossible to achieve this victory. You might say, where is faith? But I'm not so quick to get to faith. I want to know, did they obey what Moshe asked them to find out? Did they obey the agenda? Did they fulfill the agenda of their mission? And then the Torah labels what they're doing and calls it slander. They slandered the land. Vayotziu diba al ha'aretz. Now apparently you can slander, you can speak evil in a certain way, not only of people, not only of people, but of the land. What does that mean? The land doesn't have feelings. It can't be hurt. You know, what would it mean to bring out evil report, which is clearly a sin of the land, and that's what the spies are now accused of. And what do they say now? What is this to bring out evil report of the land? It turns out, again, not to be rational language. The land we pass through is a land that eats up its inhabitants. Eretz ochelet yoshveha, which has become a metaphor. You know, when we're feeling panicky about living here in one way or another, you know, then that sentence tends to see the light of day. Eretz ochelet yoshveha. You know, it doesn't always necessarily mean existential fear. It means, what can I say, the heartlessness of some of the people who live here. It's a way of criticizing our own population. Eretz ochelet yoshveha. And they come back now with this very negative view, fearful view, but I think fearful in the mode of fantasy. We feel we're going to be ground between their teeth, right? The teeth of the inhabitants. And all the people we saw there are giants. Now, notice how it's escalating. Before it was just we saw some giants. Now it's everyone was a giant. It was a giant, Anshe Midot. And then again they say, and there we saw the Nephilim. And they actually use the word from Parshat Noach, I think it is, from the beginning. There we saw the giants, and uses every possible expression for giants. And Nephilim, b'nei anak min ha-Nephilim. You know, in other words, they're almost babbling at this point. And they're babbling with, I want to say, yes, fear. But fear not of the rational kind, which is, I would say that if you're afraid of war, and you're afraid of dying in battle, I would call that a rational fear. I'm sorry to be so unspiritual about it, but you know, if you sleep well the night before, then maybe you're lacking in imagination. That's also a possibility. That you're not getting it. You know, what is war? Especially if you're outnumbered and outforced and so on. But that's not what we have here. Right? That's what it looks like. But in fact, the fear is what I'm calling the fear of neurosis, if not more than that. It's the fear of something that makes a machine of me, almost. Once I mention giants, I can't stop talking about giants. You know, I just keep coming back all the time to the fear of giants. And they finish their speech. This is the spies, the end of the spies' speech, is that famous image. And we were in our own eyes as grasshoppers, and so we were in their eyes. That's a very famous quotation. And what people often say about it is something like this. I've heard this sermon many, many times, even in non-sermon conditions, as if this is the plain meaning of the verse. That you see what happens if you have a low self-image. If you are like a grasshopper in your own eyes, if you are a mere nothing in your own eyes, then that's the way everyone else will look at you. So really it would be much more productive for your success and prosperity in the world to get a better self-image for yourself. You know, you better go out shopping and consume for yourself a better self-image. So it's a kind of pragmatic it's a kind of consumerism in a way, the way it's, you know, that the fact that you have a low self-image becomes almost a moral failing. Who said having a bad self-image is a moral failing? You know, it may be very much to your detriment, but that's not what the Torah is teaching us in general. You know, how to make friends and influence people is not really the burden of the Torah. That's not what the Torah is interested in. It's interested in other things. And so how do we understand this? And what I dislike about that interpretation has always also to do with the fact that it has to do with a certain kind of, what's the word, chauvinism? Ultra-patriotism. That means that the one virtue that's required of you is to think very well of yourself, to be totally self-confident, and then no one will mow you down. No one will. It's all very well, but I don't know if you share my distaste for this kind of teaching. However, I want to share with you what the sages say about it, in order to begin to broaden what we're talking about. This is on your page, in number 6. God says, people have said we were in our own eyes as grasshoppers. So God said, Vitarti aleha. That I don't mind so much. Vitarti aleha is not exactly I forgive that, but I don't think there's anything really wrong with that. You can say that. I feel like a grasshopper in my own eyes. That's my fantasy in a way. That's who I'm a mere nothing. God says, I can take that. You know, I'm not going to get angry about that. There's nothing to get angry about. It's maybe poor you, but you know, I can hear that. But the fact that you say, and so we were in their eyes, there I get angry, God says. Look at the way the Chachamim read this. It's almost the opposite of what we said before. The fact that you humanly have a certain fantasy about yourself, and you look at other people as giants, and you are just a mere grasshopper. No, it's maybe not very productive, not very, very good for you, but God is not going to get angry. What God is going to get angry at is you're determining the question of how other people look at you. That is, you have a right to your own fantasy. You have a right to if you have a fantasy in which you are a mere nothing, you know, and that's how that shapes your whole reality in some way, then okay, that's who you are. But if you have a right to a fantasy, then so do others. They have a right to their fantasy. Who told you? How is it put here? Do you know really what I made you in their eyes? Look at an interesting way of putting it. God is saying here, how do you know their fantasy of you? That is what I've put in their minds about you, which has nothing to do with reality either, maybe. For instance, maybe they look at you as if you're angels. Now, that has nothing to do with what you think of yourself. Why do you expect to find a mirror reaction of your own self-image in the way other people look at you? You're limiting and determining other people's richness of imagination and the way in which, I think this is the basic reality that Chazal are addressing here, the way in which, in general, human beings go around inventing one another. Inventing one another, I want to say. And I want to say that God, in this midrash, God is the one who feels, in a way, that's where I live. I don't live in the place where you are ultra-rational and you see only the absolute truth. You are you see only through kind of luminous clarity. You know who you are and you know who everybody else is. All right, that may be all very reassuring to live in a world like that, but that's not necessarily where I am. Where I am is where I'm making people think in a slightly skewed way that arises out of their own history, that arises out of their own sufferings, out of their own many, many things mean that I shape the world according to some inner secret, what's the word, like a secret code almost, that I have a secret mantra somewhere in there that in some way shapes. And if I go for therapy, if I go for psychoanalysis or whatever, it's because I myself am disturbed by the kind of fantasy I'm having about myself, and I may want to change it, and that's not such a simple thing to do. It means very deep work, at least in one view. But what God is disturbed by here is your misunderstanding of how others will see you too. Don't we often find this in relationships? That, you know, relationships are usually complex, as I've discovered. You know, I'm a slow learner, so when I speak with excitement about things you've known for many, many years, I'm not putting it on. That is, you know, you discover that even what you call friendships contain all kinds of baggage. People can like each other and dislike each other. People can be jealous of each other, can be envious of each other, and continue being friends. There are all kinds of elements in a friendship. But what comes out sometimes, surprisingly, is that I can envy you secretly. I can think I'm a grasshopper. And then one day I find out that you actually envy me for something else. You know, I look like an angel to you. Now, who knew? Yes. So we're talking about the role of fantasy in life. And we're not saying that you are right or that I'm right, but that's just the way it is. That's the way we are. If we are really interested in finding out truth, reality, then we may work towards that. But we will never totally, I want to say, and that's what we were talking about last week with Moshe and Miriam. Moshe is the only human being who comes anywhere close to the clear lens, says the Talmud. Moshe is like a spaklaria me'ira. He sees through a clear lens. He sees something close to reality. Fantasy doesn't play that much of a role in his life. But in that, he's unlike all other human beings. Lo chen avdi Moshe, God said. Moshe is not like that. What is that? You, Miriam, you, Aaron, all prophets, however great they are, you are all haunted by fantasy. You are all, as a human being, that's what constitutes you, hauntings of one kind or another. The past has left its traces within you, and it may be more than your own past. Hauntings can go further than that. Stephen Frosch, the British professor of psychology, has a book called Hauntings, a very beautiful book, based partly on Talmud and Bible, but largely on psychoanalytic sources, in which he says something very absolute, like, he puts it like this: anyone who has not at some time been haunted, had this feeling of being haunted, it perhaps is not fully a human being. You know, that what it means is that what your parents went through and what your grandparents went through in some way infiltrates you, not through conscious channels, because I don't know exactly what they went through. I may know the large facts, and nevertheless the impact is written inside me in some strange way. And it is strange. It's an uncanny idea that I'm living in some way a reality. I'm porous, you know. I'm permeable. I thought I was well sealed. I am me, and I will continue to be the same me forever and ever, and that's how I know who I am. And it turns out that I'm very affected. I'm susceptible to all kinds of radiations that come to me from people around me, from world politics, from everything in the present, and then from things from the past. Now, that kind of statement, that way of looking at things. I think of those who really went through, that is all of us, who really went through a time in which there were giants around us. At some moment in the past, we all were there. That is, when we were small children, we were surrounded by giants. Now that's in real fact. That's not a fantasy. That were people who were enormously tall all around us. And in order to look at their faces, we had to crane our necks. You know, we actually had to go like that. You know, now, does that have an effect on the child? Or is that all in the day's work? And, well, of course, when you're a child, that's how life. It's a different way of looking at things. And saying, well, no, of course it must have some effect. Call it the tallness of your parents. Call it the power of your parents, how much stronger than you they are. Call it the psychological power that your parents have over you. You need them so much that you will do anything to please them. Now, take that as a basic given set, more or less. And how different families negotiate that. Different families have different ways of dealing with that in order to make it more livable, less livable. And so you have all kinds of human beings wandering the world who once were in a situation like this and can't quite shake off, because things haven't gone in an ideal way in childhood, can't quite shake off the power of parental authority, put it like that, who will never quite feel fully the equal, even though in physical fact they have made up the gap between themselves and their parents indeed begin to get smaller and smaller, it seems. Yes, that's one of the strange things that seems to happen, in fact, but certainly in fantasy. You know, one of my children calls me Imale. And I really like it, but I can't help noticing what's happening. You know, there must be a special pleasure in saying that, aside from affection. It's a way of saying, you know, I'm big now. You are Imala, and I don't mind in the least. It's very nice. However, there is that too. And so I want to say, even in these very general terms, thinking about it as a kind of the most general motif of human growth, that we all were once grasshoppers with giants around us, yeah, could have left its traces. And somewhere there is a sense of, I don't know if I really have got out of that. I don't know if I've really got past that. That there are people who are, to me, like parents constantly. They seem to loom over me. They seem to be too authoritative for me. And it's partly my fault. You know, it's somehow the way I'm constructing the world makes it like that. I'd like to blame them, but now, let's come back then. So what happens at this point? The spies spoke in their fantasy mode, and then the people spend the night crying. Now, that's a hysterical night. It's a night in which the people, listen to how it sounds. Vatissa kol ha'eda vayitnu et kolam. It's a very slow motion description of what it's like to begin to cry. When something begins to rise up in you, your voice begins to rise up. Vatissa et kolam. They lifted up their voices and they gave their voices forth. Yeah. They express what is rising up in them, and then finally we hear the word, what are they really doing? Vayifku. And they cried. That could have been at the beginning of the verse. Right? And instead you have this sense of, we're interested in a process here. What subjectively, what does it feel like when a crying fit is beginning? And they cry all that night. And then we read, they complained against Moshe, they grumbled, the whole people complained, and they said, and so now we hear, what do they say in this mood of what I'm calling a hysterical crying fit? And what they're saying is, Lu matnu be'eretz Mitzrayim, if only we had died. If only we had died, in matnu is an unusual past tense. Yes? Matati, matnu. Whenever do you have occasion to say that? We have died, I have died. You know, that's something you never say. It's very unusual to say that. If you were dead, you wouldn't be talking. But here it's a wish. I wish I were dead. In the land of Egypt, or in this wilderness, I wish I were dead. And so they begin and end, it's like a poetic outburst, framed, I would say, by fantasy. Suddenly, how wonderful it would be to have already died. That means to be through with life, which means to be through with dying, which means to want to get rid of the prospect and the fear, the hysterical fear of that which threatens me. If the only way I could be sure not to have that anymore is if I were already dead. It's straight out of the book of Job. Yeah? Sefer Eov, chapter 3, is exactly that, where Eov is wishing that he had died before he was ever born. Right? It's a really macabre, it's a macabre chapter. And it describes somewhere the impossibility of living in time. That it's just unbearable to live in time and to be facing death. Now, that cry, which is not a rational cry, is followed up by their saying, so why did God bring us to this land? So we'd fall by the sword, and our wives and children will be taken captive, will be booty. Halo tov lanu shuv Mitzrayim. It would be good for us. And here the word good becomes not about the land, but about returning to Egypt. So what they have heard from the spies then is this. And then they come to the political statement. Let's appoint a leader, and let's return to Egypt. Now you know what's behind the political statement. What's behind the political statement is not irrational, items of dissatisfaction with the situation. It has to do a great deal with things welling up inside them, the kind of, almost hysterical welling up, and the impossibility of life. So, various ways of putting this, the terror that's involved in life. I wish we were dead. We wish we were dead. Now, this mode of fantasy is in response to what? After all, the spies brought back a good report. But it's a good report that's totally annihilated. Ephes. That's the word means. They ephesed it. Yes. They deleted it. They ephesed it by what? Sounds perhaps as if it's fear. That fear is really what rages inside them. And what I want to say is it's not rational fear. It's not just fear of the immediate situation. It's fear that has much deeper roots, and it speaks a mythic language. It speaks a language that's beyond the particular situation. It goes back and deep. And so I would add as another possibility, what is it in the past that is arising in them now, that is haunting them now? And I would say perhaps, one other suggestion, it's perhaps their own immediate history now. That is the fact that they've been so many years slaves in Egypt, persecuted as slaves, and then the sudden exodus, the plagues that happened to the Egyptians, which surrounded them, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a promise that took them out of Egypt, and then Pharaoh running after them, even when they're out of Egypt, the Red Sea, in which the Egyptians are dying behind them, and they have the walls of water on either side, and they can collapse at any moment. In other words, a continuing history of perilous survival, a sense of who are we and how can we go on being. We don't even know ourselves as slaves anymore. And therefore a kind of accumulating trauma that gathers in force until they come to Har Sinai, which is also not a blithe experience. Vayecharad kol ha'am, the whole people shuddered. There's a feeling there too of existential fear that goes very deep. It's not totally irrational. And here now, the issue of going into the land. And what they are really saying when they speak in this way is that they have no desire to go into the land. What has been killed in them is the possibility of desire, of wishing to go into the land. And I want to suggest that that's a more radical statement than it seems. Let's have a look now at Rashi. Let's see how Rashi parses the text in a way that we've already begun to break it open. Number 2 on your page. I'll start with number 2. First of all, right, let's just refer to number 1, Moshe's reaction to this outbreak in the people, this outbreak of panic, and let's return to Egypt, is that he falls on his face in front of the whole community. Vayipol al panav, vayiplu al pnehem. Moshe and Aaron fall on their faces. What is that falling on the face? Thank you very much. What is that falling on the face? Prayer, but some of the commentaries make it much more immediate. They fell on their face in a kind of feeling of defeat, feeling of despair, pleading, the Sforno will say. They are pleading with the people. That is, Moshe and Aaron are here alone, facing a people who feel totally different from the way they do. They think something is the truth, and the whole people now think differently. And when I say think, I don't really mean think. I mean their reality. That's how they understand their reality. Let's have a look at Rashi. God says to Moshe, send for yourself. What's that for yourself? And notice what Rashi does with this. Ledatcha, on your judgment. Ani eini mitzaveh lecha, I'm not commanding you. Im tirtzeh shlach. If you want, send. What has Rashi done here? 3 times over, he has said it's not a command. But it was a command. Shlach is in the imperative. But shlach lecha undercuts the imperative. Send if you want. Now, what is that? What kind of a command is that? If I say to you, eat your supper if you want. When I add the word, if you think it's the right thing to do, you should eat your supper. So in a way, that's the situation here. It's a command that immediately cancels itself. Why? Let's have a look now. What's Rashi saying here? Because when they came to enter the land, and this is how Rashi is now going to construe the whole story. Rashi is going to take the account of the spies that we get in Sefer Devarim 40 years later, when Moshe remembers what happened, and he remembers it rather differently from the way it's reported here. There we read that the people said, Nishlacha anashim lefanenu. They came and they asked to send spies. It was a popular demand. First of all, not God's command. They came and they said, in fact, they came almost in a menacing way, Vatikrevun elai kulchem. And all of you ganged up against me. You all of me, in a way, came and you came as a mob, and you came and you said, we want to send spies. That was the beginning of the story, Rashi says. And so then Moshe asked God, what should I do now? And then God said, Shlach lecha. Send if you think it's the right thing to do. Why doesn't God simply say no? How does it go here? God doesn't like the idea, according to Rashi, of sending spies. He's not in favor. He says, I told them that it is a good land there at the burning bush. God had used the word good there. I'm bringing them up to a good land. What, they don't believe me? So God takes it personally. He doesn't like it. It's not neutral. When the people say they want to send spies, it seems to cast doubt on the word of God, what God had said to them. So God doesn't like it. So why doesn't he just say no? He doesn't say no, like a parent doesn't say no to, let's say, an adolescent child. Yeah? A child who's neither child nor adult, who's somewhere in between. A child you can more or less, let's say, you can command. I don't know about that, but somewhere that's in the menu that you can command. Gets to adolescence, the child is practicing being an adult now. It's a different period. And so if you say no, that is going to cause havoc. It's going to make the child feel that you have something to hide, that you don't want the child to experience something that the child wants. And so he doesn't believe. So what you have to do in some way, what the wise parent does, is say something like this. Well, you know what I think. I don't think it's a good idea. I would command you if I could, but I'm not going to. I leave it up to you now. You make your own decision. Now, when the parent says that, and if the parent says it in a fair way, not with gritted teeth, not saying, you know what I want, but really in a way opening up freedom of choice for the young person. Then the question is, what will the young person do? What will the adolescent do? And if they do make a mistake, then that's part of the situation of having a free will. So God said, I'm going to give them room for error. I'm going to say, Shlach lecha. Go according to your judgment, send according to your judgment, and the people will then respond according to who they are and what they want. And desire and opinion and subjectivity will play a role in this. If they're making a mistake, they'll find out about it. And I don't think that's a punitive. That's not the parent being punitive. That's what's called natural consequences these days. Yes, in parent training. So they will experience the natural consequences of making a mistake. But the parent wants to save the child that. Parents still want that. But they're told to back off, right? We're told now back off, because it's no longer the time for that. The child has to develop his own capacity for making judgments and decisions. And that's what you get in this play between Shlach and Lecha. That God's view is there, he doesn't like it. And then how does the story go on? Let's continue with Rashi's story in number 4. This is Rashi now on Sefer Devarim. We're jumping to Deuteronomy. When the people asked to send spies, I liked the idea. Vayitav be'enai, Rashi says. The idea was good in my eyes. And Rashi reads this rather provocatively. It was good in my eyes, but not in the eyes of God. That is, Moshe says, subjectively, I thought it was a good idea, and I was wrong. Be'enai, the emphasis on in my eyes, means from my perspective it was good, and I turned out to be wrong. And then Rashi asks, but if Moshe was wrong, why is he rebuking the people? It's a passage of tochachot, of rebukes. And so why is he telling them off if he was wrong in commanding, in advocating for the mission? And the answer he gives is, it's one of those parables that sticks in the mind, that haunts me anyway, what I call a slow release parable. It's about a man who wants to buy a donkey, a used car, for our purposes. And the seller says, sure. And the buyer then says, and can I try it out? Can I take it for a trial run? And the seller says, sure. And the buyer says, well, up to the Golan, you know, up on the crags and the hills in the Golan, you know, just to give it a really good tryout. And the seller doesn't blink and says, yes, I think it's a wonderful idea. Why is the seller behaving this way? It's a performative act. We're talking here about a game of some kind. It's not just, I want to buy, you want to sell. What the buyer is feeling out the seller. Is the seller really confident of the quality of his used car? That there are no problems with the used car. I can find out by testing, or I can find out by testing in a confrontation. What is he willing to let me do? Well, it's this kind of game of, what's the game that's like that? Poker? Where you have to, I don't really know the rules of poker, but I gather. You know, you're watching the other person's expression. There's a little drama going on here. It's a human drama in which desire and fear are at work. When you're going to buy something, there's a lot of desire. Right? The commercial situation is a situation of desire, in a very crude sense. You know, I see something I like, and I want to buy it. I want it. I'm willing to give my things for it in exchange, like my money. And then there's the fear. Maybe I'm being cheated in some way. Maybe it's not what it looks like. Maybe I'll be disappointed. Maybe I'll overpay. I'm overpaying. And so there are the opposite poles there. And you want to make sure you're getting a good deal. And the seller is trying to make the impression that it's a good deal. Right? Let's say it really is a good deal. He's not lying, or maybe it's not. But in this case, it really is a good deal. The land really is a good land. And so when the people want to try out, find out, God, apparently, Moshe and God, are very blasé about it. They say, yeah, sure, if you want to send spies, send Gesundheit. Do what you want to do. Is it that they really feel it's such a good idea? No. They are hoping, as Rashi says there, what is the seller hoping? That the buyer will be satisfied by the game and will not insist on sending the spies. Will not insist on using the trial run. Now, so it's a game of a certain kind, and Moshe thought he's being very clever. He's being psychologically clever there. And I was wrong, because you didn't change your minds. You still insisted on sending spies. And this is a very unusual passage, in which you have a whole elaborate parable, which we go into and the ins and outs of it, only to find that it's not useful, because it didn't work. It's a way of saying all your cleverness, you know, all your determination to make things work to your best advantage. I'm going to win this bout. Surprisingly, sometimes doesn't work. In a rational world, it should work, but apparently it's not a rational world. For some odd reason, the people are so troubled by the question of the goodness of the land. It makes them feel so bad to go into this land that not all the cleverness of the exercise can soothe them, can reassure them. Now, what are we talking about here then? What is, I'm saying this is the unconscious. This is the human unconscious, which is haunted in some way. It's haunted by a sense of trouble. It's haunted by a sense of loss, a deep sense of loss, and of an expectation of loss. I don't expect to be the winner if I go for my desire. My desire is not brave. It doesn't speak loud in me. I don't really want anything. Therefore, I am a skeptic. And here I come finally to the word. What is a skeptic? A skeptic is someone who doesn't believe, right? Who doesn't believe basically there's any correlation, for instance, between language and reality. As a philosophical movement, skepticism is a kind of questioning of our capacity to understand reality, to be in any meaningful connection with reality. Now that's a very deep philosophical, almost, again, I would say it's almost a fantasy. And that's the way that Stanley Cavell deals with it. He's a contemporary philosopher, American philosopher, who writes a lot about skepticism. And he has this to say. Let me quote a couple of sentences from him. He says, you may think skepticism is just rational inquiry. That this is the way of philosophers, of intellectuals, of cerebral people, that they don't take reality for granted at face value, but they ask lots of questions. So, what is this land? We want to find out for ourselves. Nothing wrong with that, is there? You know, that's somewhere always the question. So, what was so wrong in wanting to, and what was so wrong with the report in the end? And Cavell, of all people, who is a philosopher himself and knows about rational questioning, but he says, when it comes right down to it, there is a kind of fanaticism in human beings. He calls it the skeptic as fanatic. There is a fanaticism, that is a fantasy of some kind, a compulsiveness in human beings, which is he calls world-consuming doubt. Now that's not, I'm uncertain, I want to make sure. World-consuming doubt is that doubt is a raging force in me, and it's there destroying every possibility. That every possibility of beauty that comes to me, I will immediately find a way of undermining. I will find a way because perhaps I've been hurt so much, I put it that way. I've been traumatized, I've had losses, I've lost too much. I can't believe in the blandishments, you know, of things on promise. And that, so he describes it as a psychological state rather than as an intellectual movement, someone who's just canny, who asks good questions. That skepticism, he says, is annihilation. It's the standing threat to human existence. That's very strong language. The skepticism is a standing threat, is a perpetual danger, and makes us not exist. That we cannot actually live properly if we're not prepared to know anything fully. That is to say, I acknowledge this. I acknowledge something even though I can't prove it, even though it's not perfect. Nevertheless, I'm prepared to commit myself to it, even though it's not absolutely full. Its emptiness is relative. I know something, but not everything. I call that nothing. And I say Ephes. Right? I say Ephes, it's a way of saying it doesn't meet my standards of proof. It doesn't meet it's impossible in this life that I should ever understand things fully enough to be able to commit to anything, to be able to commit myself to anything. And that is, for Cavell, it's obviously a state of mind that he knows about in himself and in others. It's not so rare, actually, in a less extreme form, that tendency to say no, it's not worth it, I can't credit it, you know, and in order to see how Chazal deal with this problem, how that the sages deal with it, I want to share with you another midrash. This time Rashi doesn't quote it. Rashi is interested in donkeys. You know, that's his parable. But let's take actually a more fraught example. Closer to us. It's not just a commercial market image. It's marrying a wife now. All right? There was buying the donkey, and now there's marrying a wife, with hyphens. Marrying a wife. And have a look now quickly at number 5. Rabbi Yeshua said, what were the people of the spies like? Like a king who provided for his son a beautiful, aristocratic, and wealthy woman. What could be better? All right, that's all the requirements. And he said to his son, I have provided for you, that word zimanti. Here she is now for you to have. A beautiful, wealthy, and aristocratic woman. And the son responded, Elech ve'ereota. Let me go and see her. Now, is he justified or isn't he justified in saying that? That is our question now. You could argue both ways, I want to say. Let's see how it continues. Let me go and see her. And the writer of the Midrash explains it by saying, because he didn't believe his father. So that's an interpretation of why he insisted on seeing. Because he didn't believe his father's word, he wanted to check out for himself. And then that becomes that he thinks his father is lying. That he thinks his father is lying. Now, you see how it's moving towards Cavell. That is, it's a tendency to be skeptical. Really, she's ugly. Then it becomes clear that the only one of the 3 requirements that the son is really concerned about is the beauty. The other 2, he does trust his father for. You know, that she's wealthy and aristocratic. It's the beauty. And surely he has a right to want to find that out for himself. But the way it's put in the Midrash is as if beauty is an objective, you know, absolutely measured like the Miss World. You know, is she number 1 Miss World? The king said she is, and the son doubts it, thinks, no, he's lying in order to get me married. Really, she's ugly. But you don't have to go that far, because all the king's son needs to be thinking is she beautiful to me? Right. Like we find shlach lecha. Is she beautiful in my judgment? Could I love her, in other words? What the whole of Sefer Bamidbar is about, I want to say, is tov and ra, the question of good and evil, not as philosophical absolutes. Not as something, either it's good or it's the opposite, it's evil. And God saying it's good and you can't argue with him. What, you're accusing him of lying? But Sefer Bamidbar is about a human reality in which the word tov means tov li. Is it good to me? Is it good in my experience? And that means basically I love it. I want to translate then. Tov is something I love, I want, I love, yeah? Desire. And ra is something I repel. That seems to me undigestible. I can't take it in. This is not something I want in my life. And that becomes the subject matter of Sefer Bamidbar. It's a book about humanity. It's not a book about gods, from on high telling you what. It's a book about human beings and how they try to digest. Right? How does it taste to me, the tam of experience? To God, it tastes good. The land is good. To Moshe, I would say, this is where we move on a little bit. To Moshe, what God says is absolute. Moshe is that only human being who sees through a clear glass. He's the only one. If God says good, that means good. It isn't just the fruit we're talking about. If the fruit is good, it's because everything is good. Ultimately, everything is good. But for no other human being is it like that. Right? That's the meaning of that lo chen avdi Moshe. That Moshe is different, he's wired differently, not in the usual human way. And what we learn from this is not about the exceptional Moshe. We don't understand that, really, that possibility. That mystical possibility that you align yourself so completely with God's taste, as it were, and you know that God knows you so thoroughly that he wouldn't provide an ugly wife for you. He wouldn't provide someone you wouldn't be able to love. Now, that kind of total identification, in a way, with God's desire, with God's estimation of things, is beyond all human beings except Moshe. That's at least what the Talmud says. How do the rest of us think? I want to find out for myself. It's a matter of love. And in fact, the rabbis say, it's not exactly a law, I think, but there's a recommendation that a person shouldn't marry a wife before he's seen her. And that's the word, to see. To see means, to, in a way, to check out. It means to see, can I love her? Yeah, this is another thing that took me many years to understand. The male fear of, can I love? Of can I love this person? On paper, she may be all very well. But this sense of not being sure that I can come through, of not being sure that I can actually be on an ongoing basis. I can be the person who is her husband, her lover, and so on. I'm saying it a bit in a roundabout way, but you know what I mean. Of course, I'm talking about potency, but potency in an emotional sense. Can I be that person that she deserves? And it's connected in the Talmud with the idea of you shall love your neighbor like yourself. Ve'ahavta et re'echa kamocha. How can you do this to another human being? To marry them, to a woman, to marry them without having found out at least a first sense of things, that you have a sense that you love her. You sense that love is possible here. And that sense of the possibility of love, becomes an ethical matter for the rabbis. That is really quite justified. You shouldn't be depending on God totally for that. You must meet her. You must see her. All right. So what do you have in this midrash? God is angry, or the Father is angry. He says, all right, you can see her. I'm not going to stop you from seeing her, because then you'll suspect me even more. Right? It's the same double bind. You'll think even more that he's lying to me. He doesn't want me to see her. So there you are caught in language in this way. And so God says, right, you can see her, but you will never see her in your house. Which is another way of using the word to see. To see meaning to relate to her, to acknowledge her you are somehow incapable of acknowledging her as your wife. And so we have here a number of possibilities. One is that the son was supposed to trust his father and marry in a traditional worldview. That might have made some sense, at the time of the Midrash. But forgive me if I'm a little dubious about even about that. Certainly now, we tend to think that a young man has every right to see the wife. And Chazal themselves understood this. Right? The Chachamim, the authors of the Midrash themselves, it can be traditional worldview, but still, there is that sense of the extremely personal nature of certain decisions. And there is such a thing as the personal area, which is not necessarily the same as the commandment. Yeah. So it's acknowledged, in which case he's perfectly justified. Or, third possibility is that maybe this son is really, in some way, he's going to turn out to be a congenital checker-outer. He's going to turn out to be a kind of compulsive, the kind of young man who will go on endless dates, just to see and never actually commit to anything. Because the one thing he can't stand in some way is the idea of, I want a wife and I want to love. In some sense, he wants there to be nothing. Everything is ephes. Everything is reduced to ephes. And that's Stanley Cavell's argument. That's why this mentality is such what he calls a standing, what does he say, a standing, what did he call it? Mm-hmm. No, I can't find it. A standing threat, thank you. A standing threat to human existence, that's right. Okay. Yes. So where are we now? Yes. So Moshe sees through a clear glass and the people don't see through a clear glass. That means people have what I may have mentioned last week, an experience perhaps sometimes of a kind of mystic wholeness, but only sometimes. There's a passage from Emerson I'd like to read you, and this is really where we've been going all along. Emerson, in an essay on nature, describing the ecstatic effects of nature on a human being. If you walk around in nature, it does amazing things to you. It suddenly makes you this kind of transcendent human being who's in touch with God and who sees through a clear glass. Suddenly all egotism vanishes, and let me read it to you. Some parts I'll pause at. He describes going for a walk on Boston Common, that's nature, halfway nature, crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight, under a clouded sky, right? Nothing very rapturous, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune. I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. There was no rational reason for me to feel happy. It was just everything was pretty muddy and twilighty, and so on. And suddenly I was overtaken by joy. Right? A kind of crack now in my previous state, and suddenly it turns out to be joy. I am glad to the brink of fear. What a statement. To the very brink of fear. In the woods, too, not only on a common, a man casts off his years as the snake his slough, and at what period soever of life is always a child. Suddenly you go back to a kind of childlike joy. In the woods is perpetual youth. Suddenly there I am, young again. In the woods we return to reason and faith. Now there are all these statements about casting off all kinds of impediments, casting off age, going back to the time of youth, of ideal, strongest feeling, of strongest joy, of strongest desire. And there I am, a fully alive person. And there I feel that nothing can befall me in life. This is the sentence. Nothing can ever happen to me. No disgrace, no calamity, which nature cannot repair. There is no such thing as irreparable harm. I am so strong in myself, there is something in me that could face with joy anything that could ever happen. Now that irrational, it's such a powerful passage, because that is indeed how one feels sometimes. How people who have a tendency to mystical experience, I won't say full-fledged mystics, I mean, I've felt like this. I remember when I was young feeling exactly like this. You know, that was my religion. That was my strongest religious sense, that there is something in me that is so strong that it really doesn't matter what. Now that is, of course, a very dangerous thing to think in view of what one comes to know later on, of what are the possibilities of irreparable harm, that there really are things that can haunt you forever afterwards, if you've even read about them, let alone undergone them in your own life. But when you're in this state, it's a state of transcendence. Emerson was the head of a movement that called themselves the transcendentalists. What are they called? Transcendentalists, right. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. Aspaclaria meira. I would suggest, it seems to me that, I'm speculating, but I think that Emerson, who knew Hebrew and who was a divine, he was a religious professional, he was someone who preached from the pulpit, I think he must have known that expression when he comes up with this transparent eyeball. What is a transparent eyeball? No egotism. He says, I am nothing, I'm transparent, I see all. There is nothing particular or quirky about me. I, in a way, am pure reason, pure faith. Everything is all one for me, and I have no disturbing ego. The currents of the universal being, in capital letters, circulate through me. That's a beautiful description of exactly what it feels like. I am nothing but a channel for the divine forces, divine energies to move through me. And he finishes by saying, I am part or particle of God. Now, what do we say? Certainly in Hasidic thought, I think in Chabad thought, it's very big, that a human being, a Jew, is chelek eloka mimal, is a part of the divine, of the supreme divine. That I am a part. It's not exactly pantheism. I think it's called panentheism. In any case, without being too technical, it's a sense that my real being, which is my eternal being, is I'm a nitzotz. Yes, I'm a spark of God. And these are ideas, but they're ideas that people have lived by. And here is Emerson from a very different place. He doesn't belong to our world, but he is describing that experience as a human experience. He doesn't even like to use the word God so much. He talks about the supreme being, or something is coursing through me. So it's a human experience he's describing. And this is a passage I've always loved, and people I know have always loved it. And then I read a critique of it that made me think again. And it's with this that I want to develop this for the time we have left. This is a critic called Mark Edmondson, and he talks about this idea of irreparable harm. And he says basically that it's a kind of illusion of immunity. And in a way, it's whistling in the dark. Emerson has just lost two people who are very close to him in his family. I don't remember the exact relation. One, a sister, and two people in his immediate family. Surely he must know something about irreparable loss. How is it? What makes him able, right? What this romantic suddenly, and he says it really comes from romantic poetry, but he is translating the poetry of the English romantics. Think of Tintern Abbey, of Wordsworth, that I see through with a clear vision, and I see through all the mere appearances of the world. And Edmondson says, here is Emerson, kind of as an American, saying, I go much further than those English romantics. I'm now speaking for the new world. And for us, there is no old age at all. You are old, you Europeans. Here I speak in a world of youth, and eternal youth, perpetual youth. And these states of being are the truth truth for me, and there's no other truth that I need to confront. And Edmondson is very unhappy about this. And he says what is lacking here is the essential human experience of loss and mourning. Without acknowledging loss, then how can one mourn for the loss? If I say that basically nothing can ever really be lost to me, because there is always, the translation into other terms, or then I never go through that important process, which is called mourning, which, of course, Freud made a great deal of. That's what he called the work of mourning, that it's a work in itself. And what is that work? I think Freud is here a good Jew when he talks about that. He comes from rabbis. Because the rabbis talked about this kind of thing, that what we have, we don't hold forever, and that there are constant fallings away from us. There are constant things that either we lose to death, the death of those who are close to us, or to our own old age, or to many things that happen in youth as well. There are many losses. And to pretend that they haven't happened is to ignore, what can I say, the savage side of reality, the savage side that has a place. It has a place within human experience. And to pretend that it doesn't exist is actually to deprive oneself of a possibility of growth. So how can you ever really love again if you remain eternally denying that you've ever lost anything? Right? In a way, it's the worst defeat to pretend that these occasional states of ecstasy, and I'm personally, that's how I would like to read it, that Emerson is justified, but the rabbis would say that's an occasional state. Sometimes one is given the grace of an experience like that. But the real work, and life is work for the rabbis, the real work is the work of dealing with loss. And Cavell says the same thing. He says the world is always leaving us. It's really a very, very poignant passage. We go to sleep at night, and in a way the world departs from us. And then the next morning we have to wake up and recover the world in some way. We have to pull it all back into us as if we really are the same person as we were yesterday. To find the continuity, to be able to see and recognize the beauty of the world, which we can only allow ourselves to do, he says, if we acknowledge, we know the reality of what happens. If we encounter things that happen to us, things happening to us is the good news in a certain sense, even though the things are bad things. There is a bracha, you say, when you get bad news, which doesn't mean you're saying it's good. You're not saying it's good, but you're beginning to speak about it. You're beginning somewhere to deal with it in words. And then what needs to ensue is some kind of conversation between the good and the bad. Not to ignore the bad, not to ignore the possibility of irreparable loss, of harm, but in some way to bring it into conversation with what the world is offering. The fact that every morning the world is bright and new, impossibly joyous. Yes, look at the sunshine in the morning. I'm being a bit simple-minded, but that's how it is. I remember at a period that was very difficult for me. I used to get up actually while it was still dark, and I used to sit out on the balcony and watch the light coming, and that was immensely comforting for some reason. That is, just to watch the process, total darkness, and then just watch how it happens. That built into things, there is darkness and there is the growth of light. And somewhere, something then about a conversation between the two. So when the people cry so desperately during the night, they cry, and Moshe then says to him at the end of 40 years, he says to them, I know what you were really saying that night. This is in Perik Aleph, Pasuk Lamed Vav of Chaf Vav of Devarim, of Sefer Devarim, 126 of Deuteronomy. You can see the Rashi on your page, actually. Number 7. What were you saying when you were crying so hysterically during that night? You were saying, I wish we were dead, and so on. But Moshe now has something else to add. You know what you were really saying? B'sinat Hashem otanu hotzianu mi'eretz Mitzrayim. It's one of the most macabre verses in the Torah. It's a verse that no one seems to remember. You know, whenever I've said it, people look at me blankly as if, you know, where did you find that? Because God hated us, he brought us out of the land of Egypt. That is, what were you reciting during the night? You were reciting a demonic narrative about how Yetziat Mitzrayim is a hate story. That how God brought us out of the land only in order to destroy us here in the wilderness. Now, why would a person or a people have such a totally skeptical view of the possibilities of the world? That God has made promises to them, but it's really just a demonic decoy to get them to go out into the wilderness and die ignominiously in the desert. Now, there are moods in which apparently human beings feel like this. That everything looks dark, that everything looks as if there's no possible joy. And what does Rashi comment on it? He makes a psychoanalytic comment. He says, you know, when you said that God hates me, what you're really doing is projection. And he more or less uses the word projection. He just describes it. He says it's when you think something, you feel something about someone else, and you say they feel it about you. Which is what the spies were doing when they said we were in their eyes as grasshoppers. That's what God gets angry about. You can feel whatever you feel, but don't contaminate other people's like God. Don't make it impossible for there to be a God. Don't make it impossible. And what you really are doing is hating God, Rashi says. You hated God. Yeah? You couldn't stand the possibility of love, you know, of love and marriage and so on. That in some way you were harmed, you were damaged so much that you couldn't actually face your own damage. You couldn't acknowledge it. Now, 40 years later, Moshe can tell them, you know, you were really hating at that moment. You were full of aggression at that moment. You were full of a certain kind of destructiveness then. And so what do you do about it? And I want to finish with two things very quickly. One is what the good spies say after the night of weeping in our story, in our parsha. The good spies, Kalev and Yehoshua, say, Tova haaretz, if only God desires it, im chafetz Hashem b'chem, if God wants you, which means really if you want God, if you can find a desire for God and the land and good things in the world, then the land is very, very good. You'll find that the land is tova mo'od mo'od. Now that's a very strange statement, because no one denied it was a good land. All the spies came back and said it was a good land. Now clearly when the good spies say it, they mean, but not the way. I don't mean good in the way that the other spies came back and made a courtesy bow in a kind of public acknowledgement. Oh yes, the advertisements are right. The oranges are very good there in Eretz Yisrael. However, Ephes. No, I mean a very, very good land. Now that has an almost childish sound to it. You know, it's children who talk like that. They say, you know, very, very. It's as if, you know, you're stuttering. And you say it. You want to say something that you don't quite know how to say. It's extremely good land. What are they actually saying here? There's a wonderful interpretation of this that I want to put on the table here as we move to finishing. This is the Hamek Davar, who I quote a fair amount, a 19th century, not Hasidic commentary. He comes from the other side of the spectrum, the other side which has to do with a kind of sagaciousness, a kind of psychoanalytic subtlety and understanding of complexity. And this is what he suggests. He says, what is a very, very good land? It reminds him of God calling the world very good. When, on the 6th day of creation. On the other days, he calls it just good. And God saw that it was good. Again, the same emphasis on seeing. God saw it as good. And then God saw it as very good. Why? Something to do with Adam. Because on the 6th day, Adam was created. And there's even a pun on Adam and Ma'od. Yes, that is an anagram. What is very good to God about the world? That there are human beings now in the world. Human beings introduce a veriness, an intensity, an intensification into the world. And then he comes out with his suggestion. And it's based on another strange midrash, which says, what is Tov Ma'od? Ze Malach HaMavet. That's the angel of death. Now that is not common sense. Right. And that's why it's interesting. It's saying basically that the great losses that human beings experience is what makes, and this is his reading, this is the Nitziv's reading, it's the experience of loss that makes the good so extremely good to us. When he says good, he means beautiful, pleasurable. He's like ta'anug. The acuteness with which we enjoy the beauty of the world has something to do with mortality. Now, we've just said two opposite things. That mortality, if we're not willing to acknowledge it, can actually block us from experiencing goodness. But if we are willing to acknowledge it and to mourn the losses, it makes us it sensitizes us in some way to the beauty of the world. And this is the Hamik Davar, who's normally very sober. You know, and here he makes his subject our intensity in how we live in the world. The fact that we don't just experience things in a kind of parav way, if one's really a human being, that one experiences things intensely. And that's how it's meant to be. We're supposed to be intense. And mortality plays a role in that. If we lived forever, and those around us lived forever, we might enjoy the world, but not as much. You know, it would be more continuous. And here we are again with the same theme that we talked about as with Miriam. Miriam keeps haunting us. You know, the lifamim, if it happens occasionally, if something comes and goes, then you're there much more for it. And I want to finish with Winnicott then. Winnicott talks about love and hate. And he says, without hate, there can be no love. What is hate? Call it aggression, destructiveness. Right? He uses all these words as if they mean the same thing. What he means is human beings, as human beings, from babyhood onwards, are aggressive creatures. It's simply the way we're made. The baby butts his way out of the womb, yeah, head first, if all is well. Yeah, it's a very complicated business if the baby does it the other way. You know, it's not a good thing. The baby does it head first, and he makes a point of that. I was interested. He was a pediatrician, aside from being a psychoanalyst. So he says that butting movement. You know, you come to know that you really exist by coming into collision with things and moving things out of your way. You know, that's where, out of the way, I want space here. You know, you make your own space. Now, that is very difficult for an adult often to accept about him or herself. That is, I am a perfectly loving, you know, friendly, easy to live with human being. I have in me nothing of that destructiveness that you're talking about, that aggressiveness that you're talking about. And Winnicott isn't buying this, and he's saying, to some extent or other, and it does vary, we all have some of that. What is the bad thing? What is the thing that really doesn't bode well? Is if a human being never can make contact with his own aggressiveness. It talks about the hate which is personal. Not the hate that's out there in the world, but my hate for people I think are good. In other words, people I love. People who I think I love, and then suddenly, for some reason, I lash out at them sometimes. And I can't stand them, actually. Maybe because they've let me down. They haven't responded to my love as I think they should have. Or maybe even without any reason. Suddenly there I am, acting very differently. And he wants his patients. He thinks the problem of people very often is that they can't ever get into touch with their own aggressiveness. And then the result is one of two things. A kind of depression, because one is not really alive then. If you haven't found aggression in yourself, then in a way you don't know what it is to enjoy the world, to enjoy playing games, to enjoy manipulating things to your will. A lot of enjoyment has to do with the aggressive impulse. And so the sages say, they have their way of putting it. Now Winnicott can't be credited to the sages because he didn't know anything about Jewish tradition. He was not Jewish. One of the few who are not Jewish, a few psychoanalysts. That's overstating it. What do the sages say? The sages say at one time they tried to, they tried to banish the Yetzer Hara from the world. And no chicken laid an egg. Yeah. The Yetzer Hara is the evil inclination, yeah, which I identify with aggression. I think that's really what's being talked about when you say the evil inclination. The destructive part of us, the part that only cares for me. And no chicken laid an egg, no hen laid an egg. That's one way of putting it. What does Winnicott say? And I'll finish with the rabbis then. So Winnicott says that his aim is in some way to make a person experience his own aggression. To know it's there, and once he knows it's there can be some kind of conversation between his aggressive side and his loving side, and to realize that there is some kind of conversation again that can happen between them, that they can talk to each other, and there can be a question then of how you live with it. That you can, hopefully, live well with these opposing forces inside yourself, whereas you can't live well through denial. And how do the rabbis put it? Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha. Love. What are the possibilities of love? What do they depend on? Loving God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. That is all-out love, energetic love, depends on your heart having two chambers, say the sages. Two bets, levavcha, not libcha. As if you have a two-chambered heart, you might actually have one, a two-chambered heart, and one of them is the Yetzer HaTov and one is the Yetzer Hara. That is, you want to love God, it has to be with both sides of you. If you edit out the challenging side, the live part, really, the part that the lion, the tiger, as Blake puts it, and only will have the lamb, then you'll find either depression or projection. That you'll have a lot of other people being aggressive around you. That's the way you'll experience your life. Other people are nasty to you all the time. You're putting it out of yourself. And so the rabbis are really saying something very strong here. And let me finish with the rabbis. So the rabbis say you want a possibility of loving God and not hating God. The first thing is to acknowledge that there is such a thing as hating. And there are reasons for it, all kinds of reasons. You know, some more in the realm of fantasy, some maybe to do with more common discourse ways of thinking. But if you acknowledge it, if you acknowledge that energy, then love becomes possible. And I do want to point out that after Moshe has referred to hatred, that you really hated, God hated, you said God hates us, and that means really you hated him. After he's used that unmentionable word, hate, we find a whole explosion of words about love in Sefer Devarim. And to me, it's no accident, you know, that God desires you, chashak, chafetz, ahav. You are commanded to love God with all your heart. That was never possible before hate came onto the scene, consciously, came into view, so that the people could take it into account. After that, suddenly, Sefer Devarim has all this very human emphasis on a relationship between human beings and God, which means a possible relationship between human beings and the land. Love, what we call love in general, love energized by kind of depth experience, a depth experience of something that might never have been acknowledged. So in the end, if the land is very, very good, it's because it contains some loss, some losses. It's because there is the dark side as well, and then we are left with a complex situation, which the spies now have to wait 40 years to somehow mature towards, somewhere be able to take on themselves that kind of sensibility that we've been talking about. Thank you.